Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Rosenzweig. I'm your host of FoodBiz Plus here at the Food Business School at the Culinary Institute of America. And I'm really delighted to have a good friend and colleague with us this afternoon, Sheryl O'Loughlin, who is
Hi, everyone.
there's Sheryl. And Sheryl is a very talented entrepreneur and is the author of this very recent, really interesting book. It's called Killing It, and it's a very personal expedition through her own experiences that she shares very candidly and forthrightly. And I think it's something that any would be food entrepreneur in particular would find quite interesting. Sheryl spent the majority of her life, professional life, in the food industry, and both in the big consumer packaged goods world and then as a startup founder, and then also has been in the academic world teaching entrepreneurship and leading the Stanford Entrepreneurial Center there, which is, we'll talk about. And now she's the CEO of REBBL, which is a exciting growth stage natural foods company, which had a really wonderful turnout at the Natural Product Show just a couple of weeks ago. I didn't get to say hello to you there because you were just so swarmed with people all the time
Yeah,
at the
it was
booth.
it was such a good show. It was so much fun. We got to sample lots of new products, so it was great. But Will, I'm so honored to be here and for you to have asked me to come on. I think you know this, but you really were part of the inspiration behind this book because you shared the idea of entrepreneurial livelihood, which really motivated me to say, let's explore this concept deeper because it is exceptionally important to the health of entrepreneurs and the companies that we run.
Right, and maybe I'll go back a little bit because what brought us into that conversation was really a couple of things. Is that now that entrepreneurship has become kind of institutionalized in the academic setting, we have lots of courses and programs and incubators. It's gone from something that's been very informal, maybe 15 years ago, to something that's quite developed. There's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of work gone into it. And also at the same time, the idea of being an entrepreneur, that people are actually serial entrepreneurs or that they choose to be an entrepreneur, and that there's been kind of, in my terms, the celebrification of the entrepreneur, as kind of a hero. Certainly, certain entrepreneurs have made lots of money, other entrepreneurs have had an impact in the world, and the idea of becoming so heralded in the culture was something that I saw, to be very interesting. So when you and I started talking, I thought, how do we prepare people for this entrepreneurial livelihood, this world with enormous ups and downs and pressures and expectations, and also only really a small fraction of happy endings compared to the number of people that actually set out on the journey. So I think it
So
was
true.
that conversation and that
Yes,
backdrop that we were both seeing in our respective, institutions, you at Stanford and me at Berkeley.
that's right.
And here we are in the hotbed of Silicon Valley, where now, 25, 30, 40% of the students who go to business school want to become entrepreneurs. And that was unheard of when you went to get your
Oh
MBA,
my
right?
God, mind blowing. But please do not say how old I am. Well, don't go that down that path. It was a
But
while ago.
but talk about how business school sort of changed from when you went and what the expectations and why you went to business school, because some of our guests online today, they actually were wondering about that. Like, do you need to have
Yeah.
an MBA to go be an entrepreneur? Is that a good use of time? Or so maybe talk about how it's changed and then your perspectives now.
Well, it had vastly changed. I mean, at that time, the big thing to do was become a brand manager or go into consulting. And for me, I really went into it not knowing at that point in time that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. but I knew I wanted to learn how to run a business really well. And for me, the pathway into that was going into brand management and learning from what these gold standard companies had done and how they approached marketing was where I started. And I think that for a long time, and I remember specifically at business school, I had one class in entrepreneurship, and literally at the school there was only one class in all of Kellogg. I went to Northwestern. And I remember the teacher talking, and what he would talk about was the stories of his experiences, but it was almost like magic. Like you couldn't really figure out exactly what it was. There was this potion that somehow would come to you. And I think it is so wonderful now, and you teaching what you're teaching and me having taught some of the methodologies I've taught, there had been a lot of questions in the past. Can you really learn this stuff, or is it just a personality trait? And I think part of that plays into it, but there are really good methodologies where when I've taught people, alumni will come back and say, I wish I would have known this when I was starting my company. So I believe there's a lot of value in the training that schools like the Food Business School is able to provide to people. Whether or not you need an MBA, that's a question, that's a choice. For me, I felt that it was very important, but you're showing there are other ways to get an education in entrepreneurship beyond just the traditional path.
So one of the skill sets that we talk about a lot in entrepreneurship is pattern recognition, the ability to see things occur over and over again in a way that you might anticipate what the outcomes of a decision might be. And I think what's really wonderful about your book now is that it's kind of consolidated so much of your own, personal experience and, and the emotion around that experience. And I think our listeners today should understand, that you have spent the majority of your career in businesses that have been very mission focused, that these aren't just businesses that want to, build a product, but these are companies that want to change the world. That gets thrown around a lot today. But, when you started with, particularly when you went to Cliff Bar, that was a new kind of company at that time.
Yeah.
And that was trying to set a higher standard. And is Cliff Bar still one of the few remaining independently owned companies, isn't it, in the natural foods industry? I think Cliff and maybe Amy's Kitchen are two of the long-standing companies. And more we're seeing the little companies get acquired by the big companies. So I'm really interested in, let's talk a little bit about pattern recognition. Maybe there's many topics in your book. I love the way it's organized, where you kind of, you have different topics, but then you always kind of loop back and you're helpful to the reader to say, well, remember when I talked about this at the beginning of the book or in chapter 3?
Thanks,
so
Will.
you're kind of demonstrating pattern recognition in the book, and you're kind of teaching it indirectly. So I really like that.
Oh, thank you.
Let's talk about pattern recognition with investors first, because a lot of our students are always asking, how do I get investors? How do I know if they're going to be the right kind of investor? How do I discern when there's such asymmetry in the power of the relationship, particularly for a first-time entrepreneur? How do I know? Can you talk a little bit about your experiences?
And I'll talk about it from the standpoint of having been through the hard way and learning my lessons in finding a very different path. And I think you brought up a good word that I want to circle back to in the course of this conversation, the asymmetry, because there can be asymmetry, but then there could be also a recognition that the asymmetry could actually cause worse results ultimately for the company. And I'll explain what I mean. So I had an investor in my company, Plum, and it was a challenge, a real challenge. And little did I know that almost every other entrepreneur that had been been on the other side of these investment dollars that this investor brought had the same experiences with me. But I didn't share. I mean, what I had been experiencing was, almost like a neighborhood bully where he kind of kept me on my toes. One day, you're the greatest CEO in the world. The next day, you're the worst CEO in the world. I mean, literally, when I would be in board meetings, I'd get texts in phone call board meetings. I get texts from him saying what I was doing wrong while I was presenting in the meeting. It was brutal. And in the midst of the already ups and downs that you go through in your own company, and we can talk about later how my husband started a company at the same time, so it made things all the more complicated and stressful. And that investor relationship burned me out because I felt like I was constantly chasing the wrong things that were not moving the business forward. And I have such a different relationship with my investors now. And I think part of what I realize, is bring in investors, if you can, that understand your business. My investors now, including Mark Rampolla, who's the founder of Zico Coconut Water. He started an investment firm called Power Plant, as well as Dwayne Primovitz, Carol Byers, and Bill Weiland, who started an organization called Bigger. They're business people. They have run businesses. They understand that, and it brings a very different philosophy to the conversation, a philosophy of knowing what the ups and downs are and knowing how to support the entrepreneur along the way, and that using a whip actually makes it so the company takes a real step back from progress because you're focusing on that whip as opposed to being in true partnership. So I think one of the things to look for, again, using your word, asymmetry, is if you have asymmetry in that relationship, got to question if that's the right relationship. I would also say talk to everybody. Many of us investors, we get nervous. We need the dollars. We need them quickly. But that first dollar that you take changes the course of your company, whether you like it or not, in a positive way or in a very negative way. And so what investors will do is they'll give you the list of references that you asked for. You'll also give them your list of references. But what happens when they're looking at you? They're calling every single person that's not on that list. As entrepreneurs, we need to find out every single person that's not on their list and make those calls. It is essential. Now, let me tell you another thing, which is, I think, unusual, but is starting to become much more usual, which is the vulnerability that I have with my investors and what my investors are giving back to me. Let me explain that for a second, because it's very different, and I'd really like to change. I want to talk to investors out there, too, to change the nature of this relationship, because, again, I think it changes the fate of the company. And that is, my investor, Dwayne, from Bigger, he's on my board. I adore this man. I talk to him once a week, every week, not because he wants me to, because I want to, because he adds such value to the way I conduct, myself as a leader. And one day, this was just about a week and a half ago, he called me up and he said, "Hey, Sheryl, I want to share with you." He has a wonderful relationship with his wife, and one of the things that they've done is they've found a way to go very deep emotionally, and it's called emotional therapy, I think. I might have the name wrong. But he started sharing this with me, and he said, I think there's some things we can learn about how we work together. And as he's talking about it and talking about the depths that it has allowed him to get into himself, I said, "Okay, Dwayne, I want to have this conversation right now." I said, "I want you to know things are going really, really well at REBBL, and I wake up almost every morning in a panic because I'm like, shit, I hope I could say this on this podcast. I don't know when the next shoe's going to drop because something is going to happen." And he said back to me, wow, I really understand that, because one of the fears I have is that I'm not giving you what you need as an entrepreneur. You know, I'm doing this for my first time. I don't know. And I was able to say to him, look it, our phone calls, the reason why I do that every week is because I come out of that feeling like I can change the world. You're doing
Mm,
exactly the right thing because you make me feel strong as a leader. And
mm.
to have, to find an investor that you can do that with, again, changes the course of your health, your relationships with the people you love, and the relationship you have with your company.
So what I'm hearing in that is that just to be in a situation with somebody where you can feel heard and where there's also an acknowledgement of that everybody's growing.
Yes.
It's just important kind of bedrock, and there used to be a pattern, quite significant pattern in venture capital, which was kind of a belief that the person who starts a company isn't necessarily the one who's meant to grow it to scale. And even in
Yeah.
your current
Right.
situation, you've come in to join a young founder who's
Yes.
still part of the company, but who you're growing, you're taking the lead now with your experience. So making those transitions in a business is really challenging. And you talk about in the book, the importance of kind of knowing when to let go. And I think entrepreneurs invest, a lot of ourselves. We may not have, when we start out, we don't have necessarily the capital. We
Right.
definitely put skin in the game, but we invest so much of our own personal identity and, the meaning in our life. And some people call that sweat equity. It's worth a lot. But I think, it's interesting. There used to be this kind of play that VCs would run, which was, and I remember this very vividly because this happened to me early in the days of Republic of Tea, because I was kind of romance. I was very young. I was about 31 or 32, and I was romanced by a big time VC firm in the Bay Area, and they had just kind of hit a home run because they were the money in Starbucks, and
Oh, wow.
Starbucks had gone public, and they were their senior partner had been very successful guy who had been a senior executive at Procter and Gamble, and he was wonderful. I saw him as a mentor, and then as we were getting close, they were talking about making an investment, and my head was really spinning. I hadn't anticipated that, and I'll never forget. I was sitting across from him at his desk, and he said, "You'll make a great chairman."
Oh, interesting.
And he was kind of painting the picture for me that I was going to be a chairman and an ambassador, and it was really interesting because I was like, oh, that's generous of you, but actually, I started this company because probably nobody would have ever hired me to do it. I mean that. So I wasn't quite ready for that. I didn't end up going down that path, but that was just something to kind of that that people who start a company need to realize that as soon as you take somebody else's money, it's incumbent upon you to return it. It's incumbent upon you to understand the expectations of return that an investor has.
Yeah.
And, we've seen a lot of people kind of get into trouble. There's a pattern called friends and family. You go to your family members, you go to your school classmates, and you round up all this money. Sometimes that can get you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. It becomes very personal then, doesn't it?
Yes. So I think as soon as you take investment capital, you enter into a whole different kind of conversation and relationship, certainly. And
Well, and
you talk about that in the book a bit. And
yeah. Yeah, I think, again, I just find your word, and this is going to stick with me. You always do this to me, Will. And I think about what you say for so long in my brain. This concept of asymmetry, I think, goes into a little bit of what you're talking about, and where so many times we come out feeling at the mercy of those dollars. And granted, it's hard not to do that. And with certain investors, you are at their mercy, but those are the wrong investors, in my opinion. But I think there's an idea of having the humility in yourself and the boldness of your vision of the company and what you want to do for the company that needs to be front and center, which is there might be a time where there's a stage of the company that you don't adore. And you don't have to be good at every single stage. Different people like different stages. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we can control, and it's okay to say, you know what, it's not my time anymore. But I
Mm-hmm.
believe so much in my company that I want my company to live forever, well beyond me. And there's something else that now is my calling to do. And being able to control seems like a funny word for me, but really to control your destiny more by recognizing in yourself with humility what it is that you're really passionate about, you care about, and that you're really good at. Because once you get good at understanding that about yourself, you're not at the mercy of other people because you control what the conversation is.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you an example just from, my own time at Plum where I said, you know what, I think my time is done here for a variety of reasons, a lot of which came down to personal stress that I was dealing with. And I liken that to Paulo Hawken, who you just mentioned, who's the co-founder and chief innovation officer of REBBL, who is a brilliant product developer. He was CEO of the company for 3 years. He never wanted to be CEO. He knew that was not something that drove his passion. He wanted to be the product innovator guy, the beverage guru that made these beautiful tasting products. And so it worked out so well, and I think that's why our partnership fits so well, is because he knows what he wants and what he's really good at, and I know what I want and I'm really good at. And so the marriage is perfect. And I think that's so important in our companies to understand how to build those partnerships, because those
Mm-hmm.
partnerships are really ultimately what creates the best companies.
That's well said. And I think the other dynamic that's interesting is that these partnerships change and evolve. You talked
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit about your relationship with Neil Grimmer at Plum, who many of our students know because he's also involved with Food Business School. And you mentioned
And
even
he's
in your book
brilliant.
a
Yes.
kind of warm uh, reconnection you had with him over our
Yeah.
faculty retreat. But one of the things that I think is so interesting, and I love the idea of bold humility. I think that is a very strong takeaway, and it was very nice for you to acknowledge Frances Moore Lapay, who
Mm,
was the first person you had heard use that term, and it's
yeah.
certainly something she embodies. It's really this idea of being strong and courageous and present, but not arrogant, and to be humble. And frankly, at Republic of Tea, one of our core values was humility. We used to have a T-shirt that said "Humility is energy," and
I love it.
I think that it's certainly a quality that I've really tried to cultivate, in my career, because we're always learning, and if people are projecting that they're beyond that, they're not really being honest with themselves or the world. But unfortunately, our culture buys that. I mean, it's kind of an archetype of boldness,
Yes.
not necessarily humility. And sometimes I think people are afraid, as you kind of point out in the book, to recognize that humility is not it's not a stigma, and it's not a weakness. It can actually be a strength. But that being said, I find it so fascinating that the founding stories of companies get rewritten, because most companies are started by more than one person,
Yes.
and it's rare that both of those people, sort of evolve with the company. And
Yes.
so I always get a kick out of asking people who are kind of like my kids' age, in their 20s, like, you've heard of Steve Jobs, but do you know who Steve Wozniak is? Have you ever heard of Paul Allen? So most companies have a co-founding team.
Yeah.
And, I think you mentioned your investor now. I always encourage young entrepreneurs to bring a wise uncle or a wise aunt, um,
Mm.
kind of a, for lack of a better word, sort of a counselor, a good attorney can actually play this role, but somebody who is engaged, but not personally, at risk about the outcome of what happens, who can provide this kind of mirror and this safe environment for co-founders or partners to have a forum, to talk about things and work things out. So I've always tried now in the construct of the ventures that I shepherd or try to create, that we have somebody that plays that role
That's
kind of formally.
so wonderful that you do that. There needs to be, quite frankly, a business therapist. I haven't seen anyone with that title, but I think it's really, really important. You have to. I mean, ourselves and our relationships with the people that we're in partnership, those are relationships. We sometimes put business in one box and personal in the other box. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And we're all human beings with opinions, with emotions, with different ways of going through our lives. And the biggest thing that gets in between all of that is communication.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be with my spouse, with my kids, with my investor, with Paulo, that stuff happens and it can get in the way, and it's being able to clear that out and have a safe space, to your point, where people can open up and say, this is really hard. And to your point earlier, we have this culture in entrepreneurship about everything's great. We all talk about how everything's great, and there's a reason for that. Especially when you start on a journey, who else is going to come along? I shouldn't even call it a journey, because to me it's really an epic adventure. It's not any kind of walk on a path. But we have to get people to come along with us, whether they be our suppliers or investors or even employees. Who wants to go on this ride not knowing what it's going to be about? And a lot of times all we have is a vision. So everything has to be great. And man, if we don't believe in it, and we don't love it with all our heart and soul, we shouldn't be doing it in the first place. It's too hard. But at the same time, there has to be a place where we can open up with other entrepreneurs and be able to say, this is hard. I feel like I'm falling apart. I think I'm going crazy and I need help. It's the reason why I wrote this book. What makes me so happy is people will write into me and say, I thought I was crazy. Thank you for making me feel like I'm not crazy. And, whether that support you get for, I think as entrepreneurs, we are a tribe and we need to support each other. And if I would have talked more openly with other entrepreneurs, I would have realized what kind of investor I was bringing into my company at Plum. But I also think it's other people, to your point. It's some sort of advisor who's a third party. It could be, I have the benefit of having a husband who is an entrepreneur. He gets it. So I can spend time talking to him about that and working through that. Everybody needs somebody. And the first thing we do as entrepreneurs, we go right into isolation because we are so busy. We shut the world out, and it's the worst thing we can possibly do is to do that. Take the time to nurture your relationships because they breathe life into you. They remind you who you are way beyond your company, and you bring all that energy back in a company when you do that. That is good use of time.
Mm-hmm. So this is, I think, your third time as a CEO of a food related company. You came into Cliff Bar. You were in charge of marketing, and then you grew into the CEO role. You were the founder of Plum and the founding CEO, and now you've come in with in a partnership with a great product developer, and you're the CEO. So Jonathan, who's watching us today, he wants to know what trait should a great CEO drive to cultivate when you think of what are the what are the qualities that best serve you now after all this experience? What would you tell other people that are in that kind of founder to CEO transition?
Yeah, very good question. And I, I think that part of it, I guess, as I look at the things that I've done very wrong and the things that I feel like I'm doing more often very right because of what I've learned. And that's the first thing, is to know this whole thing is a learning experience and not hold ourselves up to a standard that we have to know all the answers. We have to be the all-powerful. People are looking to us for leadership and direction, but again, goes back to that word humility, to have people know that you're learning too, and you're going to keep getting better every single solitary day, and that you're all human beings together, I think is so important, because it makes people understand that you are a real person. You're like them. I'll always remember, this was way back in my Cliff Bar days when I was running marketing, but I always would walk in, and I have a lot of passion, a lot of energy, and I'd walk into the room, I'd always be like, everything's great, everything's perfect, we're having so much fun. And I had this woman, Kate, I will never forget this. She looked at me and she said, Sheryl, I am calling your bullshit. She said, if you really think that this is what it's like every day, then you're missing something and you are not in tune with the business or with us. And that stopped me in that moment where I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That is not to say every day we go around and saying the earth is falling apart, I'm going to lose my mind. People are looking to us at leadership. But again, it goes back to those words, bold humility. How do we use the beauty of the tension between two words that almost seem like oxymorons to bring those together to create power in ourselves as leaders, as being bold, but yet being real human beings? And one of the things I talk about with people all the time in my company is we all need to say when we need help. And I think that historically the word help is thought of as a word that means that you're not good enough, you're weak. And to me, that is the greatest strength in the world, not only for that person, but for the team and the company to be able to say, I need help. Because that's when other people are going to come in, the company will be lifted, and by the way, that person who needed help will have the opportunity to learn. I'll say one more thing that is important for me, and I think people are on two sides of the spectrum on this. Some leaders tend to come in with an extreme. So some leaders come in saying, I'm going to be the authority, I'm going to drive everything, and everything's going to be done by me. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs do go in with that kind of philosophy. There's other entrepreneurs, like where I was on the other end of the spectrum, that think, I'm going to try to be the best leader that everybody likes, and I'm going to collaborate on everything. Well, what I found out was, at the end of the day, I was so busy collaborating that no one knew what they were supposed to do, because I was waiting for other people to finally come up together with the answer. That's consensus. So it's finding that balance in the middle where you get the best of both. So you can't be authoritarian at all times. You're not bringing your people out. And by the way, you're probably blind when you're leading. On the other hand, by being too collaborative, you're not giving people enough direction to move, because in a startup, you gotta move.
This is such a great topic and one of my favorite ones. I've got a couple of thoughts. One is developing the capability to actually co-create on a team takes time, and it takes intention. And I know you're aware of this, there's a wonderful tool in the Fifth Discipline Field Book, which is one of my favorite tool books for organizational learning. But there's something called the ladder of inference. And what's interesting is a lot of CEOs, you and maybe me for an example to some extent, a lot of CEOs are kind of natural salespeople, in the sense that they can convey a vision with an enthusiasm. It can inspire other people. People want to join. That you mentioned that, a lot of what entrepreneurs do is to get people to kind of get into our band. you know.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies historically, in particularly in American cultures, are very hierarchical, and they call that command and control. So it'd be
Yes.
somebody's in charge and they tell somebody else what to do. But we've learned through management science over the years that the most effective teams are the ones that actually can co-create. So this model of inference actually stratifies the different steps of going from kind of telling to selling to consulting to, actual full collaboration. And I know in my own career, the most satisfying experiences have been when I've come to the table of a team and I don't know the answer. And I
Mm-hmm.
trust that the team is so good and so engaged and so smart and so much better at their jobs than I am, that the answer, the right answer, will actually emerge from the conversation around the table. And you'll notice that's a very rare energy and dynamic, because a lot of people come to the table expecting somebody else to have the answer. And if you're
Yeah.
the CEO and you've set the precedent for always looking like you have the answer,
Yes.
they'll expect you to have the answer. But it's a
Yes.
very different role to be a CEO and show up at the table and say, okay, are we asking the right question? And then shall we explore what the right answer might be? And it's
Yeah.
completely different experience.
That's so beautifully said, Will. And I think I would add to that to say part of the a big part of the CEO role, as you said, to ask the right questions. But also I think it's to bring together and bring the clarity out of what is coming from the conversation, to say, here are the insights. Now, there's going to be people with different opinions. Here's the ones that we're going to say, hey, this has come up and we'll pay attention to this. But here's where we need to go based on this conversation. And I think that's the one piece that I missed of the whole thing, is being able to say, okay, I'm still the leader, so at the end of the day, they need to hear me say, here's where we're going based on what we just talked about.
Right. So somebody in situations like that where there might not be clarity of agreement, somebody has to decide and somebody has to take responsibility for that decision. So that's a really important trait, of a CEO. Let's think about, and you mentioned this idea of kind of having somebody be able to call you on your bullshit, and you have a whole chapter on that in the book.
Yes.
And so it's, how do you think about like hiring people that have the courage to do that? What have
Ah,
you learned?
what a great question. And I don't know if I have the answer. But I think it's having, when I'm talking to people on the phone, I'm interviewing, and I've been interviewing actually right now for a bunch of senior level positions, which I'm thrilled about the people that are joining our company. But one of the things I make sure that I understand in the course of that conversation is that that person has a point of view, and a point of view that they own. Now, I also want to know that they're willing to discuss it and they don't think it is the only point of view, but that they do have something that they're bringing to the table in terms of their leadership, because that's what I'm hiring them for. But I also think it doesn't end with an interview. You just don't bring in the perfect relationship. Relationships are nurtured. And the way we are as leaders and CEOs to help to bring that point of view forward, and to I don't know if this is the right word, but to use deference to that leader, to say that leader knows where they want to go, and I need to trust. That's why I'm hiring that leader, is to do that. Now, I want to have a discussion, and I want to collaborate, and if God forbid if someone's always saying to me, yes, okay, yes, okay, yes, okay, I am going to change the course of that conversation to say, hey, I don't want to be taking the lead here. I want to challenge your thinking. But at the end of the day, we've got to support. Our job as leaders is to support the leaders we hire to bring out their best. Because just like you said, I'm always hiring people that are way smarter than I am. And God forbid I squash that. That is detrimental to the company and the team.
Well, and one of the risks of being an enthusiastic sort of sales oriented CEO is to expect people to actually validate your own selling, all the time. But
Yeah.
remember back in the day when we were working on brand new brands, one of the things
Yeah.
I learned about interviewing was that I like to take people out of their element. And so
Mm.
whenever I got close to a final interview for a very senior position, I always took a person on a hike.
Oh, that's a great
Right.
one.
We went on a very, we happened to be in an, we happened to be in an area um, where there was really good hiking, but we would go on a hike. And it really was a way for both, connecting at a much deeper level, like you were talking about earlier, getting to that, trying to get beyond that kind of selling each other on the opportunity and, and going deep together and then going into a space where, perhaps people were a little bit more vulnerable because they
Yeah.
were out of breath or they were being, challenged and maybe being, less guarded about, just so that was one thing I
We
always remember.
we have one that we use at REBBL, which is we're all about plant-based foods and the purity of plant-based foods. So in an interview, we'll say to a candidate, what kind of plants are you and why, if you were a plant? And we all have our own plants, and you get to know people by what plant they describe about themselves. And we celebrate that. We buy each other the plants, and we have a little plaque on the person's plant. But to have that be part of the culture helps people to not only understand themselves, but also other people to understand what they bring to the table as leaders.
That's nice. So let's move into maybe this final chapter because our time is running out. But one of the things that I think you can speak to probably more profoundly than many entrepreneurs is just kind of the illusion of balance. People want to have a balanced lifestyle. They want to start a company. They want to have a family and a happy marriage, and they want it all. And as you and I both have experienced and learned, it's really difficult. And
Yeah.
I often in my classes will tell people, if you want balance in your life, forget about entrepreneurship. There is no balance. If you want to start a company, everybody, your employees, your investors, your customers, they're all expecting you to be all in. Now, so that in itself infers that it's pretty difficult to have a balance. You're not going to be able to work 6 weeks and take 2 weeks off, and come back. You're going to be pretty much on all the time. But you experienced a lot of the pain. You internalized a lot of your experience in a way that was not healthy for you, and obviously that had ramifications. You're very lucky to have a very supportive partner, husband. Your kids have been patient. You've gone through a lot, and so maybe share with our learners here kind of what your perspective is now on this idea of kind of sustaining, regenerating, being in it for the long haul, and maybe what are some of the warning signs that you actually now see in retrospect that you would want to share with people?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of packed in there. So, one of the things I think about, people are constantly asking me, how do you balance it all? And I'm like, I can't. I'm going to be honest. It is not perfect. It does not always look pretty. But I think about it as an ecosystem, and then I'm constantly trying to nurture different parts of my ecosystem. And an ecosystem is never in perfect balance. It's always rebalancing. And so I look at all the priorities in my life and the role they play and the role they play to nurture the other parts. And so I kind of bring those forward in a way that is right to me. And I want to say something specific about that, which is, and I know particularly being a woman, women entrepreneurs feel a lot of this pressure that they have the guilt of, I'm not being a good mom. I'm not being a good wife. Look at, I'm working all the time. What does that mean about me? And I've come to learn, and this was my partner helped a lot in this, that I'm the mom in the way that I can be the best mom. And trying to be a mom in a different kind of way, I'm not bringing my authenticity to the relationship, and my kids know that. So let me give you an example of that. When we first moved up to Santa Rosa in wine country, when right down the street from where you guys are at the CIA, I was like, I took a little time off and I thought, okay, now I'm going to be the best mom and I'm gonna join the PTA board. And I was the secretary of the PTA board. Shoot me in the head. That was a horrible experience that made me insane. And I'm looking at all these other people in the room and they're all like, I'm going to make these cupcakes and these pretty flower plants for the kids. And I'm like, I'm done. And I realized then in that moment, that's not me. I am not bringing anything in my best self when I do that role for my kids. The role in my kids, I'll tell you, it's inspired by a book. If anyone knows this book, you'll know how touching it is, and I can't even read it to my kids still to this day without tearing up. And it's called, it talks about a mom and her son, her baby, and she has this line that she uses, which is, I love you forever, I like you for always, for as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. And my mantra to me in my mothership is, how do I show my kids that I love them in every way that I can? How can I do it in a way that's meaningful to me and to them? And for my husband, it might be like throwing him around in the backyard. For me, it's reading books together and going and looking at art together. That's the best mom I can be. And I'll tell you the other thing that happened the other day that made me so happy. This was about 2 years ago. My kids came home from school. They're 16 and 13 now. And I said to them, what do you think of women leaders? And they looked at me and said, both of them, my two boys, I don't understand the question. And to me, by modeling what I'm doing in my job as an entrepreneur and leading in the way I'm leading and leading with heart and love, I bring my love to my kids over to my employees. That to them, that to me is showing them the best I can give as a parent and an entrepreneur together. So I think it's really understanding the roles that these play. And I will also say, and I alluded to this earlier, I went into myself as an entrepreneur. I put myself in isolation because I was so stressed out about the company I was starting at the same time that my husband started a company called Blue Sky Family Cub. And that company blew up, and for a variety of reasons, but it took all of our money. We had so much debt that we almost went bankrupt. And we had to move out of our house right away. We just finished paying off the rest of our SBA loan last year, 8 years after we started the company. And I started going down a really bad path. The path was, I'm going to reduce stress by running. And then I would run all the time. And then I had to run, because I'm competitive with myself, as much as I did the day before, if not more. And then I cut back on my eating a little bit. And I started to realize, people were starting to say, Sheryl, you're losing some weight. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. Everyone wants to lose a little weight. And then I'm looking at the scale and I'm seeing the numbers go down on the scale. And all of a sudden I'm like, my life is out of control. But subconsciously, here I'm in complete control. And that went down a path, as you've read about, that I developed anorexia. And so, at that point, when you lose your health, I couldn't give to my company. I couldn't give to my family. I was spent, completely spent. And what I came out of that realizing is that the importance of relationships, of friendships, of family, of relationships, real relationships, human relationships with your employees and your investors, those are the nourishment, and eating healthy and meditating and doing all that stuff as well. That's the nourishment that allows you to bring the best to your company and for teams, and for any investor listening, please know how essential that is. Make sure the entrepreneur has the support, to your point earlier, Will, that they need in order to help the companies thrive. Because how are you going to get a return on your investment? That investment in your entrepreneur and making sure that they are healthy is probably one of the greatest investments you can make.
Well, I just, I want to, once again, I want to recommend Cheryl's book. I think it's a great kind of antidote to a lot of the books that are written now that don't really have bold humility, honestly. I think your book really did capture, the spirit of your journey and what you've learned. And you were very generous, I think, to share it. And I would just say, if you're a food entrepreneur, particularly where there's a strong kind of personal identification with the mission of the company, and you want to learn some of the both the kind of inner qualities that Sheryl has reflected on and brings out, and some of the strategies for business building. I think this is a great read for you. It's an easy read, I should say. It's kind of like sitting down with Sheryl, and the ideas are well organized, and I think it's a great gift and contribution. So I just want to thank you for going to the trouble. It's a lot of work to get a book
Well,
out in the
thank you,
world,
Will.
and I
Can
hope
I can I add one more
yeah,
comment to that
sure,
too, building on
sure.
something you said? I think the concept of self-worth and not equating your self-worth with the net worth of your company is essential. And that's what I lost sight of. When I was going through what I was going through, I thought I was a complete failure. And we are so wrapped up, and our identities are so wrapped up in our companies, because it's art that we're creating, truly. And just like any artist, we see ourselves on that canvas of our companies. And many times our net worth of ourselves is put into the company, but yet our lives are going to go way on, hopefully, beyond our companies, and our companies will thrive without us. And so to be able to separate and to be able to say, I am not the numbers on my P&L. They may go down, they may go up. When going down doesn't mean I've failed. Going up doesn't mean I'm the greatest hero in the world. It's
I'm not
knowing the difference.
right. I'm
Right.
not my last valuation.
That's right.
Um, but you make such a good point, and I've tried to practice two things that support that. One is I am always cognizant that if I'm successful as an entrepreneurial leader, that the organization that I help create has a life of its own. So I always try to see the enterprise now separate from myself. And I didn't always understand that, but now I see that, I may just be like a channel or a vessel or something, a steward, if you will. So just always remember your business has a life of its own. And the other thing, just to kind of, it's a nuance, but I really believe very powerfully in the importance of the words we use. I encourage people not to use the words my company. I heard an entrepreneur the other day say,
Right.
when I sold my company, this, and this. And it was kind of a bold, it was that macho, I sold my company. And I thought, well, I actually knew the backstory on that entrepreneur. And, first of all, it wasn't really his company. I mean, he was the CEO. He was there when it was sold, but so many people were responsible for that. So many people put so much
So
into it, whether
true.
they were employees or investors or partners or so. I just would encourage people to say, when I was involved in selling our company, or
Yes.
when our company was acquired, or the company that I had the good fortune of being part of when it was sold. That's a way you
So
would
true.
articulate bold humility.
That is beautifully said, Will. I've met many entrepreneurs who actually do exactly what you said and say, it's me, and they forget about the team behind. The team behind them they think is down here, and they're way up here. It shouldn't be like that. It's a partnership. You create it together. It's
Yeah.
so true.
Well, it's been great to have you here, Sheryl, and
Thank
I want to
you.
thank all of our listeners today for joining us. We will be back with you next month. We've got two more terrific Food Biz Plus programs set up. Next month, we're going to have Megan Mokri, who's a graduate of the Haas School of Business and the Food Business School, and she's the CEO and co-founder of Bite Foods, which is bringing healthy foods to small and medium-sized businesses through a smart refrigerator platform that's really cool. And Megan is another inspiring CEO. Just had her second child. She's really doing
Yay!
well. And then we will wrap up this series, this semester, with a great conversation with David Lee, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Impossible Foods. And we'll
Mm.
talk about